This is Below the Surface, an Eclipsium podcast where we talk about supply chain and firmware security. It features guests from the cybersecurity industry and discuss the problems surrounding supply chain related issues and potential solutions. Welcome everyone to Eclipsium's Below the Surface for December 2022. I'm Paul Asadorian. I'm the principal security evangelist for Eclipsium. I'm joined by Mr. Scott Schefferman. Scott, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me. As always, this is super fun.
Absolutely. We have a special guest on this episode. Mr. Tyler Robinson is here with us. Tyler, welcome.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Scott. I'm so excited for this. This is going to be a fantastic episode.
Yeah, Scott, you went all out in your latest threat report. You gave us a lot of content to get through. We won't get through every single topic, so I want to make sure our audience and our listeners know to check out eclipsium.com, go to the threat report section where you can read the full threat report. Scott, you bring up a lot of great, I don't want to call them predictions, I want to call them theories, because I think, but I actually think it's a better term for it. Some of the theories that are on there, the first one actually that I want to cover, threats both to and from the technology supply chain will increase exponentially due to exposed weaknesses in the firmware SDLC, vulnerability research advancements, and economic computing challenges.
Yeah.
What was the, give us the high level behind that one, Scott?
Yeah, I mean, for the audience, like pretty much we collected a bunch of predictions from folks inside Eclipsium and trust groups as well, folks like Tyler as well, just reached out, touched a lot of sources, and came up with some of my own as well, put them in there. This one, and almost all of them boil down to either a destructive or a supply chain or a nexus of those two type of topics as it happens. So on this one, I mean, this one is almost obvious, right? Like, it's on like Donkey Kong. I don't know how else to say it. Like, the supply chain itself, the macro, starting at the top, the macro landscape right now is when we're in the middle of a chip war against China. We're moving production domestically. Russians being sanctioned so much that they're having to steal traffic cameras out of Sweden just to power the cameras on their drones. And that actually that's an analogy to the entire landscape for them. All of their computing resources are being starved. So there's a race to develop the best chip over that's normally a 10-year process. Intel wants to do that in 3 years and put the United States and the West on a dominant landscape. China's very aware of that. So at the macro level, this is absolutely crazy. So what that's doing is every superpower, if you will, involved in this entire situation has a different political will than they did yesterday, right? Like, this is a new era we're in, and that political will is going to drive them to take advantage of offensive capabilities they can implant inside the supply chain, or like Russia often does, and criminal actors too, attack the supply chain as a place to actually get presence and persistence or disrupt and destruct the production of the IT supply chain itself. So it's the supply chain is massive and complex, like we know, but every single aspect of that supply chain comes into play under this new light, where the political will and the competition is becoming. We're not in a cooperative competition anymore. We're in a balkanized competition. That changes everything.
Yeah, and I think that anytime we see a change to something a new process, a new goal to, whether it's to move parts of the supply chain more close to home, the security usually takes a back seat to that. I think all of us have been around long enough to know that anytime it's like, oh, we're going to have this new version, this new process, this new manufacturing plant, that's going to open up, I think, avenues for attack, because security isn't always the first priority I think it's a priority, but it's not the top priority. The top priority is to start making chips here in the US, as an example, not to have the most secure supply chain, because there's still a supply chain. Even if it doesn't matter where the chips are manufactured, we all know that firmware and all these bits of different hardware and keys and certificates are all part of the complex supply chain that
Well, that and
ultimately
the
delivers you
threat
your computer at
landscape
the end
and
of the day.
geopolitical side of this, like the threat landscape has changed. Like you're saying, once you bring this in-house to the United States, because they have to try harder and they have to go to different efforts and lengths to do that, which means they're now attacking IoT heavier. They have to have the inroads. They're attacking the hardware, trying to get that bootkit in there so that you're laying low and have that ongoing persistence, because our tools and processes are getting better, and if we do bring it in house, it allows more control. But that just means we're playing with a more sophisticated actor. And then you add the geopolitical side of this, like Scott was saying, like we're playing once Ukraine and Russia war kicked off, and China seen their opportunity to start, diving down Taiwan's play, and we got involved. We've got all of these geopolitical things that we are not as technologists often thinking about, but they play the biggest role in how we have to look at our threat landscape, look at the actors we're dealing with, and then evaluate how we're actually going to go about securing this. And like you said, on this fast track, security is going to take a backseat, and we have no way to get that up to speed quick enough to do this. And it's going to happen. So, how do we actually take steps to alleviate some of that or put mitigations in place?
Well, it's a great segue, Tyler, to one of Scott's other points that I put next because Scott, you said the collection of software, firmware, and hardware bill of materials will be an insufficient mitigation for supply chain threats. I agree, and I hate to be on the panel and always be like agreeing with each other, but I've been I think I have strong criticisms to the S bombs and bills of materials, not because I think they're a bad idea entirely. I think it's all about how you use them and what value they provide. And I think people overestimate the value that it provides. I think people say, well, we have all these supply chain issues. So let's just have an S bomb or an F bomb. And like magically, magic pixie dust, all our problems go away. Right?
Yeah. So
It's a piece of puzzle.
yeah,
Well,
that's
I
great.
wouldn't say
So
that, but
So the background here is I went to our VP John Lucades, who's been at Eclipsium since practically day one in 2017, and has a tremendous amount of experience working with NIST and the U.S. government and vendors on the supply chain dilemma, heavily focused on SBOM, et cetera. And obviously, John is the one that internally at Eclipsium, anyway, came up with the F bomb term, and we all laughed at dinner one night when he dropped the F bomb. But John's background is very unique, and he has a lot of insight here, and it really aligns well with my DoD insight as well, because the DoD does this all the time. You do your bill of materials, you understand your vendor provenance, you build trust around those vendors as you're developing a $30 billion satellite system or something like this, right? So in that context, we saw all the time that you can put your best foot forward, understand SBOM provenance, where the developers are located, where the software comes from, open source software included, and you still end up with things like implants and backdoors and all the problems. And John's point here is that even if we fast forward to sometime in the future, in 5 years or 3 years, where all the S bomb and F bomb and H bomb hardware bill of materials is perfect, like it's literally perfect, you're still left with the fact that as a decision maker in an organization, let's say as a CISO, you have to now, if you're taking that security control and saying, I'm now responsible for understanding SBOM dynamics, guess what that also does to you? It puts you in a position of responsibility now, where now you have to say, oh, if I decide not to go with, I'm going to use a random vendor, Acer laptops anymore because of a supply chain issue that I know I have in my environment because of SBOM, it doesn't mean you get to just rip out all the Acers because you're the CISO and you understand SBOM, because you have all the compatibility, you have all the dependencies, you have technology refresh, you have production uptime, you have end users, you have all of these things that all of a sudden, as a security person or a CISO leader, or even as the board, you're now going to have to make these crazy risk decisions that you haven't even had the power to make in the past because you were blind without SBOM. So it creates a new level of challenge for organizations once you try to take security control over the hardware and firmware in your environment.
Especially
I
with
like the
the
predictive
the
game. Go ahead,
economy
Tyler.
though, the economy too. We've got this
Mhm.
kind of zero flat budget that we're either going to see for a little while this recession plays out. That means that we're not going to have the capability to be ripping out a whole bunch of hardware, even though we know those risks. So we come into this interesting state where we see a risk, we know a risk, but due to budgetary constraints, and maybe even there's regulatory stuff that is now forcing you to do this. Like, how do you actually do something you can't do because of the lack of money and or process? Maybe you don't even have the staff, or you've bought into something that only works on Lenovo laptops or a Dell Open Manage or HP ILO. Like all of the management and control of these, like these are long-standing, very expensive systems that an ecosystem you've probably bought into for the last 10 years. So you got all this technical debt now on top of having to manage this at a lower level that you should have been thinking about anyway, but now you have to actually figure it out because it is widely and been put on paper. So you have an obligation. Before, it's all theory, right? Like no one knows what's in the
Yeah.
firmware. No one knows what's how secure it is. Now, when you start getting these F bombs and you start to look at all these bill of materials, you have an obligation because it has been provided to you in a data set. So you're responsible.
Yeah, I can imagine a CISO being asked by the board because they read something in the Wall Street Journal that says there's a massive supply chain coming out and it's affecting this manufacturer model, and now you're gonna have the board's gonna go to you as a CISO and say, what's our exposure? And so yeah, SBOM will give you that, but it's not gonna alleviate everything you just talked about. It's,
Yeah, but I think you need to do the investigation and the analytics before the board asks you the question. I think you already need to know what you have out there. And this is
excellent.
somewhat a page out of vulnerability management and asset management. But if you already know what you have out there, you can do some pretty basic analytics and go, what is my oldest software? What is my oldest CVE? What is my oldest hardware? What is my oldest chips inside of my hardware?
Well,
You know,
so that last point
right?
though, it's like it's not just make and model, right? Like that's
No.
asset management. Now
Yeah.
we're
What
talking about
version
the
of
component
TPM do I
level.
have in my systems? And once you know that, then you've got to do something about it. You've got to put it in a mitigating control. You've got to put in a plan. You've got to put in extra monitoring. You've got to have, take action based on those analytics. And I'm not saying you're going to solve every single problem in your organization with one fell swoop, because we all know it doesn't work that way. But if you say, hey, here's my oldest laptops, I put this additional software on them, I'm monitoring for these conditions, knowing that maybe they're more vulnerable to certain types of attacks. That's a great. Then when the board comes to you, like, yeah, I know where that stuff is. And guess what? If the firmware changes, we bought this great software called Eclipsium. There's a shameless plug, right? That tells us if this firmware changes or if the bootloader changed on it, because we know. And by the way, there's a 6 month or 1 year plan to replace that hardware.
That's it.
I also think that segues nicely into one of your next points, which it's highly likely within the next 2 years, a self-propagating ransomware with persistence via firmware implant will be developed and released. And
All
I
right.
think that I think we're primed for this.
I
I
got to
think we're.
disagree with Scott on this one.
You think
I'm
it's going to happen
sorry.
sooner?
Yeah, like next month.
Like when we're all on a holiday break is when it's going to happen, because that's
well,
usually when
well,
it happens.
Yep.
Paul, this is why we wanted Tyler on the show as well, because
Mhm.
Tyler has a tremendous amount of experience working with infrastructure, designing it, managing it, etc., and attacking it as well as a red teamer. He's one of the best in the world as far as I'm concerned. Not to blow smoke, but I mean, there's a reason why we wanted you on this episode specifically, along with all the other episodes you end up being on. But this one is like, so. I mean, this actually came. I went to our one of our sales engineers, Wes, and I said, Wes, what's your prediction? And he came up with this. Like he just dropped it in like 30
Yeah.
seconds right into the Slack chat. I'm like, are you kidding me? So I mean, when you think about self-propagating, the question I have for Tyler is very specific here, right? Self-propagating, normally people think, okay, it's going to go across the internet to self-propagate. But today's architectures don't require just internet to propagate, because there's so many aspects going on in the cloud. There's so many aspects going on at the management layer, right? So what are your thoughts there? I mean, I haven't even warmed you up on this, but I know you come warmed up. So what do you got?
So my prediction is the self-propagation is 1,000%. We're going to see this being leveraged through IoT wearable devices. I think will be a huge platform in which think about your ability to get something to someone's laptop. Well, our phones, our laptops, our watches are all using Bluetooth Low Energy, NFC. You're going to have these kits that implant, and then they're able to protocol shift in order to make a move, propagate themselves to targets that has some sort of intelligence AI, maybe some ML decision trees. Maybe it's just looking for very specific key indicators, but they'll leverage these self propagations for later botnet implants, but they're going to use them more for finding the target without having to use traditional 0 days, initial access, phishing, those will all still be a thing. But the self-replication across hardware to get to a low-level implant is where they have to live. Like I've already been looking at a bunch of stuff with living in a GPU, living low-level in IPMI BNCs, with the network stack being available and having auto updating. Like these are things that attackers and people that make these kits and even us security researchers, like if we can write this stuff, 1,000% nation states are doing the exact same thing. Now taking that to the next step is the internet is getting a lot better at being able to detect, find infrastructure, understand the communication. So living in things that are day to day, things like your application, like TikTok on your phone, right? Okay, so it is collecting a bunch of data, probably sending it to China, doing whatever it does. What happens when there's that one update that opens an API that allows access to update your microphone? Like, this is where it gets very interesting, where you start to think about, is your app sandboxed? Have you given it too much permission? And does that mean that it can implant and live on something other than the application once you install it?
Uh,
That's terrifying because it's so hard to dissect.
But I think we
so
we base we base some of these decisions on assumptions. And I think this is similar to the assumption that, well, we won't see an IoT based worm run across the internet because there's too many different architectures, too many different types of devices. And to have one worm that would attack all of them, we're basically going to see smaller pockets. Then Mirai came along and we're like, oh, I guess they
Oh,
got around that limitation. And I think the big assumption that we see with UEFI based firmware, PCs, servers, laptops is, well, an attacker has to be on my system. I think the
okay.
exterior is
we're
very
there.
right. It's very brittle. It's very brittle in the amount of the number of attack paths that lead to an attacker being on your system are vast. You can't defend that landscape, and you can't defend your network running under the assumption that an attacker is never going to be on one of my systems, because eventually it's going to happen. It's just a matter of how much time and effort someone has to go through. I don't dispute the fact that you can do defense really well, make it really hard for an attacker, but it's never 100%. And what you need to defend for is, if someone does get in that device, how do I like limit the blast radius and the amount of damage and the amount of spread that that can do? And I
So
think limiting their capacity to hide, to have such high level privileges on the device via firmware, is a really good step to take.
yeah, I mean, I'm gonna double down when you said Mirai too, because
Hmm.
and pivoting off of what Tyler brought up with IoT, there's a lot of chatter going on in certain trust groups that some of us are a part of, where there's a lot of weird stuff going on inside the home. Televisions. I won't mention the a very well known audio system that fits in and it gives you surround sound and has speakers all throughout the room. Like there's a firmware updates happening on their own. There's weird operations going on TVs. People's phones are acting differently than they have been recently. And obviously, we are always paranoid as security practitioners, but there's been something shifted in the last month about literally with the devices inside the home and how the home network is operating. Also, how routing is going on lately, like really, really weird long uh, response times on pings and routers that are flapping that never used to flap. All sorts of just weird, like BGP level stuff going on all over South America. Like, there's probably something bigger going on. It's really hard to see that because we're all in our little homes. We don't take the time to analyze the firmware on our Samsung or our LG TV. But there's definitely some weird stuff going on lately. I'll put it like
Yeah,
that.
and it's interesting as we talk about theories, and I sometimes I cringe when my theories come true because I've put my evil hat on, and I've theorized in the past when I was really heavy into researching IoT devices that, like, what happens when it becomes a jumping off point? And again, I think this is always an assumption that we make, that it's like not going to happen because we haven't seen it happen in the real world. But let's do some threat modeling and say, what if one of these devices is compromised and is used as a jumping off point to infect other things? And I think, Tyler, you're right, the phones play into that too. I often theorize that you put malware on a phone to jump inside the network, right? Your phone is connected to the network. It's then connected now to your Wi Fi and has access to all your TVs and all these things that are typically in a flat network. This even goes over to enterprises too that have this issue. So
Yeah,
it works both ways, right? I compromise a device, they can compromise a phone. And I think we're going to see these types of threats become more popular as other avenues get more difficult, right? We're going to
yeah,
talk today in a podcast about the changing face of pen testing. Think about how much that's changed even in the past 5 years.
yeah. There's no home. There's no firewall at any home. Nobody's. I don't care. I mean, even the most paranoid security guy has a television, and these things are beaconing out to grab a firmware update, and your firewall's not stopping that. Like all these devices are phoning out, and the implicit trust you're providing to all of those vendors. Let's be honest. The vast majority based in China or
with an app
Chinese
on your
code at
with an
least,
app on your phone that
or in
manages it
Asia.
too. So
What?
Yeah, but also like geographic location doesn't matter. I flagged a story for later about I think it was Anchor came out with a camera and someone did the evaluation on it and was like this thing says it doesn't talk to the cloud, but it's totally talking to the cloud. And by the way, there's a lot of other security vulnerabilities here that let anyone view the stream of your camera. So again, this issue comes down to trust. How much do we trust these devices that
but
are
can we
inside our
can we
network that
change
are
that?
firmware based? Because
Implicitly.
we can't trust what the manufacturer says. Maybe they're completely honest and they just introduced a bug and they haven't found it yet. I mean, that's we've seen that a million times, and that's fine too. Maybe they knew about it and shipped it anyway. I mean, there's a million different scenarios, but the point is, how do we build trust with these devices inside of our network, whether they're talking to China or wherever they're talking to?
Paul, give us a destructive topic because we can't run out of time before we covered the kind of the other half of the theme. No
Yeah.
matter what. Do you have one of
You
those
want
lined
to
up?
talk Connie Group and vigilante hacktivism?
Yeah.
Is that where you want to go?
Well, that'll be a good pivot into
I mean,
anything
we've
destructive.
we've seen we've seen the
Yeah.
destruction happening.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
So yeah. Okay. So destructive attacks will increase and begin to target the hypervisor and cloud infrastructure at scale. Yeah, we haven't really talked about the destructive nature. We've kind of talked about the pivoting, the gaining access, the persisting, but it's another very
okay.
scary thing, man. Like what happens when someone goes, oh, I just want to destroy the device?
Let me do a 30-second set the stage for this. Right. So we talked about the global landscape and how the political will has shifted to target supply chain. Same statement applies to the political will to be destructive, both by criminals and nation states, but also that third class of actor, the same threat report it looks at, which is this vigilante hacktivism that's
Hmm.
often state funded or state backed as well. And the problem with those groups, unlike hacktivists of the past, like these groups are loud and proud. They're claiming victory. They're
Hmm.
saying, "Look, we just took out this," or "Look, we're about to take out this. Watch what happens." So there's a competitive, ego-driven, community-driven, a government-encouraged, government-funded apparatus that's never existed like anything like this before in the past. That is summarily out there to do one thing, which is to disrupt or destroy and claim victory. And what this does is advance all the timelines because you might have persistence at a power plant as Russia that you've had for 4 years in the United States. You've never turned that trigger to destructive because you haven't had the political will to do that because you are afraid of the retribution, the retaliation, or you're playing that as a card politically, right? But these actors, these hacktivists, and these criminal groups working with in fact, the whole underground itself are out there beating their chest every day. So if they turn that same switch with that same persistence, right, that changes everything because you get collateral damage, you get the problem of attribution. Most of these APT actors now are acting like criminal actors, dropping ransomware payloads, and they're not just there to make money. They're not making money. They're there to wipe. They're there to disrupt. They're there to gain persistence or divert from other activities they're actually doing. And so all of this confluence of all this stuff together means that the destructive motive, I've said this a lot of times, every espionage campaign and persistence campaign literally is one line of code away 90% of the time from going from espionage long-term motive, the value of that, to I can bring down the environment via the Active Directory and the exact same tooling and presence they already have inside the network. And the difference is when is that timeline? And that timeline is being pushed up. The political will is pushed up, and the actual conflict, the cyber conflict itself, is full scale.
Yeah, a lot of times they just want to wipe out their presence.
Well,
Yeah, just
It's
get
there.
rid
I
of
mean,
them.
it's there on
well,
purpose so they can wipe
that
out
you
any
have you
trace of
have these
evidence, well,
nation
as much
states
as they
that,
can,
like you
right?
said, are acting within inside of these criminal orgs. So you can have handlers that are managing entire organizations, and it'll you have no attribution. You don't even know who within inside the organization is part of a nation state. So the ability to do attribution, misattribution, and the political ramification of that, when you start to think about a large scale war, you bring in something like Taiwan and China, or the supply chain and the ability to leverage, will distract, and or push an agenda where they already have these groups under control, and they're feeding them intel, they're giving them toolkits and pretending to be, from different nations. So they're already setting up the chess and pawn pieces. They've been doing this for a little while. Like, we have not been naive or blind to this. I don't think everybody has, but I don't think everybody realizes how many pieces are off the board right now. Like, it is a precipice for the right time to use this. You think about, if China wants to go take Taiwan and their initiative is there, what is stopping them from having full on ransomware, shutting down infrastructure, taking down the financial system, and letting Russia and Ukraine, duke it out because they started something over there with destructive ransomware, and we have to go step in as NATO now. Like, now they have full carte blanche to go take over
Yeah,
Taiwan because we are all busy in 500 other areas that they have been setting up for years. Like, we cannot be blind.
but now put that, Tyler, with your perspective really quick on baseboard management controllers.
that
Just
is
pick one
that is
firmware
the
thing.
place where they can now control, maintain that long-term access, and they can set up for things that they don't have to worry about: the OS, the EDR, the next firewall that is getting put on. They can live so low for such a long time because that firmware never gets updated. Even if it does get updated, they can live in the update and still do that well. And they have access to everything at the hypervisor level. You look at the cloud, you bring in Azure AD cloud, from the baseband, you are below even the hypervisor. The hypervisor is, I would say, lower than the OS, which is what's running our Active Directory, running our password managers, our SaaS application. You think about how many things are controlled via API, and the ability to manage, pick a vector, financial. You want to take down the financial system? Take down some clouds. You start to take down clouds. What manages all of those millions of cloud servers and hardware? It's all at the baseband. And you can only do that large scale at the baseband.
Yeah, and you can destroy the baseband too. You can brick the device effectively because the baseband is often used to restore a system that was taken down. But if you destroy the BMC itself, you don't really have any
There's
recourse.
not
That
people on
device is
site for these.
indefinitely
Like, these are
down.
underground,
That's
these
a
are highly
different.
secure, and they wheel them in
Yeah,
on,
but
on
even it,
forklifts just to get the racks and the compute power put into a place. You're not going to replace those overnight. You're not going to replace those in an SLA within the next week, especially if it's done during a supply chain timing issue that it is already hard to get stuff. Like, this all circles back around.
right. And also, how do you get the salt or the firmware to put
The
back on
vendor's
the
not going to
chip?
give it to you.
I mean, oftentimes when you get an update, like it's just the update, and you're getting modules, inside of those capsules that are updating your firmware. You're not getting the entire piece of firmware, software, and data configuration to rebuild the flash chip that stores the firmware that runs your BMC, right? You're just getting updates. So
Time to
if
time to
you
fly with
wipe that
SPI
out,
chips.
now you're in this weird thing. Like, it depends. It
Well,
depends.
so
How
I
do I
mean,
rebuild it? If I can't,
and,
or the manufacturer is going to be more forthcoming in providing people this, but in order to apply it, sometimes you have to go down on the hardware level to apply it.
and get this, like, okay, that's baseboard management controllers. But think about the research like our Nate Warfield at Eclipsium has been doing on edge devices, load balancers, VPNs. Those are the most critical devices, much like the cloud example. The same thing applies to your gateway that's in a remote workforce world where you can persist there. And there's a lot of advantages to wanting to persist there indefinitely because you can continuously drop payloads, continuously drop wipers, even if you're trying to be destructive. But guess what else you can do? You can brick those devices indefinitely well if you want to. And if you do that across 5,000 F5 devices at once because you've managed to hit an O day or a CVE that just got dropped, and these things are getting hit left and right for access, what if you decide, okay, any financial target that's got an F5, a Citrix ADC, a Fortinet device, a Pulse Secure device. We're going to just drop those devices hard. You're screwed as an operation.
Well,
You're screwed.
add them shorting
You know the
money
thing
or
where
putting the
it
political
always
aspect
tells
like
you
the
when you're
sanctions
updating.
where they're looking to short the money, move the money to set the markets on fire. Well, they've already prepped and set up because they know what's coming, and then you start dropping stuff like that again. This has multifaceted, multi-implication, not just from pure destructive, but what does the destruction play out? How does that affect the next supply chain or the next third party that's relying on this service? Now you've got a cascading effect, not to mention the media and the misinformation, disinformation, and fear that's going to go out across that. So you can have entire countries starting to short our stocks, play with our money that's already within the recession. They can collapse an economy just by collapsing some firewalls at the right time with the right motives behind it, setting that up.
That's right.
You know what's interesting is when you update firmware on a device, it always tells you, hey, don't power it off while it's updating firmware. But the BMCs control power. So think about that combination of, well, maybe I'll just kick off an update process, then I'll go into the BMC and I'll just power everything down while it's updating firmware. That could be a bad day for someone. That's the kind of control when we talk about it's below hypervisor level, it's below operating system level. That's the kind of control that it exerts.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this conversation goes so many directions, like Tyler's indicating too, because it does tie right back to that supply chain. I mean, malicious. Like when I was in the DoD, we worried
Mm-hmm.
about logic bombs. You guys remember logic bombs? Like nobody talks about those anymore. But guess what? It's a different world. We're not cooperating with China on the chip level, on the manufacturing level anymore. We're absolutely not. It's actually on. Like this challenge is on. So logic bombs come right back into play. And if you drop a bunch of devices all at the same time, kind of to Tyler's point, because you inserted a logic bomb or somebody pushes a firmware update on purpose, you've got a big problem all of the sudden that does create a lot of noise and chatter and can be timed effectively.
Yeah, you know what's interesting is one of the thoughts I had this year that I thought was interesting, and I haven't come up with great examples, and I've actually talked to a few more people about it. Is and it came from the Star Wars example when we realized that the flaw in the thermal exhaust port was a vulnerability that was put there on purpose, and it's not that it was a backdoor or a logic bomb necessarily. It was legit a vulnerability that was put there on purpose. And I like that with my evil hat on. I like that because backdoors tend to get discovered. Right? Is a great line from war games, right? Backdoors are not secrets.
Hmm.
Right? But vulnerabilities can persist for a really long time.
Root,
Look at some of the open
ping,
source vulnerabilities in
pseudo.
critical code in sudo that persisted for like 20 years. So if I'm an attacker, I'm like, well, maybe I'll introduce a vulnerability because no one will notice it. The problem with my theory is once you exploit it, eyeballs start to go on it and it tends to get noticed. So you've got a short time window, but you can have those things there strategically, which I think is pretty scary.
And you have the plausible deniability as an actor inside a
Vulnerabilities
vendor,
happen all the time, right? Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But I mean, so the SDLC itself, like this is not just about devices and firmware and the hardware supply chain. It's also at the most important technology, Microsoft. Like I don't want to mention all these vendors, but Microsoft's an obvious one. But like even security vendors, like we really need to worry about our SDLCs on the software and on the device level because that's what's being attacked, whether it's a malicious insider or whether it's somebody who actually controls the SDLC and has access to the source code. All the like the Python libraries that are being exploited that are in everything, SSL, like it goes on and on. These vulnerabilities, are they there on purpose or not? At the end of the day, to an enterprise, it really almost doesn't matter.
Mm.
Right? That's the thing. That's what's so messed up about it. Is like a vulnerability that gives you RCE. It doesn't matter why it's there. It's a problem,
I think
and it
it's
will be
going to
discovered and
continue to
exploited in the
to
wild.
get bad though
Yeah, and
because
go ahead, Tom.
we're at that point where we do not have the resources or technical prowess. There's not enough people that are smart enough to evaluate these millions and millions of lines of code that are getting created in just a single library. You start to talk about APIs, and then you look at the SaaS integrations between those APIs, and then you start to look at the routing and the software running the routing and the hardware of those. Like the amount of code and our ability to secure the code or have a secure SDLC, we can't do that as humans anymore. I think we've well past that point. So now we have to start looking at the technology. This is where I believe AI and ML has really good capabilities to evaluate at scale a lot of lines of code. But then you talk about the tainting of something like an AI or ML model, and you have the ability to maliciously implant that or flag it or falsely flag the code as it's doing the evaluation manually or ignoring certain pieces of the code. Again, we're back to that whole thing. So we have a point at which can we do anything about it other than maintain and get the mitigations right starting from the very bottom. And I think that's the important part. Like that's where I love Eclipse. I don't even work for them, and they're probably my favorite company to rep because they're starting at the point we all should be thinking about, which is the lowest possible point that then protects each layer above it. And you have to do all the layers. It's defense in depth. Like we've lost our defense in depth, our ZTNA zero trust, like whatever the latest thing that is doing good security. That is where we need to get back to, but we have to start at the right point. Otherwise, it doesn't matter. Like if you start at the wrong point, it doesn't work.
And I
Yeah.
think starting at that right point is knowing what you have, right? Which is some of what our product does, but also one of those fundamental things you'll find in a lot of standards, recommendations, compliance is you have to know what you have. And when we talk about supply chain risk, knowing what you have as deep into the supply chain as you can is is a good first step, right? I mean, we kind of picked on S bombs a little bit, but that's a huge portion of that picture of I have to know
Yeah.
what I have, right? So your S bomb is your first step.
So,
But then you got to do
so
stuff with it, right? There's a lot of things that come after that to prevent a lot of the attacks and destructive things and persistence that we talked about. I think one of the big things for me that I plucked out was having a secure update process and implementing it well on both the supplier and the consumer side, right? Being able to know when there's an update, making sure that update has integrity, and applying those updates is a huge second step to knowing what you have.
So Paul, my favorite prediction of all this is aligned with what you just said, which is from Vlad, one of our
Mhm.
most amazing
Love
researchers,
Vlad.
a beautiful mind beyond words. And you ask somebody like that for a prediction, and it's amazing how you can condense all of that brilliance to just a simple statement, which is like it's going to get worse, and it probably already has. And it ties to a corollary that my father, as a Marine, taught me, which is their version of Murphy's law, is a corollary that says anything that can go wrong, probably will.
Hmm.
But in it already has. You just don't know it yet, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So the point there for Vlad is like once we actually get products like Eclipsium and visibility into S bomb and F bomb and H bomb out there, and we start to see what's actually inside all of these enterprises and critical infrastructure and finance and inside technology companies. Once we actually open our eyes to the breadth and the depth and
Hmm.
the impact potential related to those threats that we haven't even discovered yet. Because these threats that, like UEFI threats or BMC threats, you don't find them often because, like Tyler's saying, we're not tooled or resourced to do that yet. But once we go there, because of requirements or this global conflict we're in, we will see so much. It's going to be just completely bonkers what that does to enterprise risk management and supply chain risk management and third party risk management. Like your MSSP, like once you ask your MSSP to attest to their firmware and hardware and device level security, imagine the burden on that MSSP to
Hmm.
to and this is a dynamic. This is not a snapshot in time. It's just like everything else in cybersecurity. You can't say, "Well, I bought these and they're configured with secured core." Secured core is not. It's a whole suite of technologies, even all shipped with no vulnerabilities. What happens is the vendor ships a misconfigured secure core PC,
Yeah.
so it's just as vulnerable as if it weren't secured core. you know, it's like it's all secured core. There's no back doors. There's no vulnerabilities,
As
but
an
it's
enterprise, we've got to get
misconfigured.
back to not taking the firmware as just or the hardware layer. We have to actually take that very seriously and start treating these like critical assets. These need to be like the domain controllers. These need to be secured, updated, thought about as the BMCs within inside of these computers need to be thought of as an asset. And I think that's where once we start to get that visibility, once we start to look at this and we see how bad this really, how deep the rabbit hole starts to go, we have to take the hardware more seriously. You think about your firmware on even a personal desktop. It's something that, like, yeah, I know I need to update it. Next time I'll update it. If I'm having an issue, I'll go update the firmware. It's not like that's not my first security point that is forefront of my mind. And I think we have to start changing that. And even the vendors realizing they can't just ship crap firmware or crap configurations. The hardware almost seems secondary. The firmware, if it works, it almost seems like a secondary concern from a security and feature side. It's there, it does what it needs to do, and hey, there's some nice features, but we'll just turn them all on in case they want them so that they work. That is got to change that mindset around hardware being that first vector of input. We've put a lot of effort on the firewall for a little while. We've done email filtering now. Now we're at the EDR endpoint, XDR, whatever it is right now. All of those things, we've been putting those focus points as the threat landscapes change. It's time to shift that to the hardware side of what the threat landscape is.
Scott,
Yeah,
closing thoughts, Scott.
yeah, well, I guess I'm just going to put off what Tyler said, because when we say the word hardware or firmware, all we mean is software. And there is a tremendous, actually, the majority of operating systems in a 50,000 device network is firmware operating systems. The majority, for every one Windows OS you have 4 or 5 or 10 sub operating systems running software that's dynamic, talking to each other, that phones up for firmware updates, that allows bidirectional communication to and from the operating system, whether it's the UEFI or the BMC, that ships with drivers that are used for privilege escalation or run system level commands as a user. All of this package of software, whether it's at the hardware firmware application layer, all of that is one giant supply chain challenge that we have. And we're not looking at that, to Tyler's point, holistically enough to understand the entire iceberg underneath the water. We're so focused on this little tip up here, EDR, XDR, AV, spear phishing. That's not the game right now. That is not the problem we have. And the three of us are looking forward. Eclipse Team's looking forward. A lot of people are looking forward. Even the U.S. government is looking way ahead compared to the rest of the cyber industry. As cyber practitioners, we suck at this aspect of cybersecurity. As an entire industry, I'm at 25 years in the industry before I even had an inkling of a clue of how powerful, impactful, and relatively easy it is now to target the device level firmware. Like, I had no idea after 25 years and doing all the requirements across DISA, NSA, DoD, compliance, all of it. All of that has been latent, but now the U.S. government is coming through and saying, no, if you're going to settle the federal government, you have to show and attest that you're developing secure firmware and devices before the government can procure it. And that's just that's just the coming out of the executive order. I mean, It's going to get way more nuanced than that. And I think it's ironic that we as hackers, as a community, are so reluctant to spend time looking at this space. We're so myopic in how we present the security problem as our own vendor telemetry and solution molds us into as practitioners. It's not the game. The game is much bigger than we are as a cybersecurity industry. It needs government. It needs industry. It needs all the things to even get remotely solved.
Scott, Tyler, thank you so much for appearing on this edition of Below the Surface.
Thanks for having us. Tyler, you're awesome, man. Thanks
Happy holidays, everyone. We'll see you next year.